I entered the industry in end of the 50s, and there was only a choice of two film companies in the whole of New Zealand. It was the National Film Unit or Pacific Films, and they were the only two substantial film companies operating at that time. And it was just pre-television, so Pacific Films used to do they were representatives for the Fox Movietone News in Australia, and we used to do their items, and they had their own Pacific magazine, which was a cinema reel that used to show, and we did sponsored documentaries. And so it was very, in those days, if you took a camera out to the street, people thought you were surveying. They had no idea you were a filmmaker, and they said, why don't you get a proper job? It was very strange. And you feel like you were this tiny minority of people in New Zealand actually trying to make films. I'd made a little short film, an experimental film, which I'd shot myself, and John O'Shea was impressed with what I'd done, but it was all self-taught, And then the cameraman suddenly had a domestic row and couldn't come at the last moment, and John turned to me and said, "You're the D.O.P," and I panicked, So I bought every book I could find on how to paint with light and all that sort of thing. We got down the South Island of New Zealand, and we were in this hotel, and John pulled the whole crew together and said, "Look, I've just been told by the bank I've got to close the production down because we've run out of money. Now, I reckon we've got 2 weeks to finish shooting, but if we could finish it in 5 days, we could get out of here with a movie, And we said, "We're in, John," and so we did. I remember when we were doing the interior scenes, I couldn't get rid of shadows and lighting. I was having a terrible job, and I wanted it to look like the Italian films I'd seen, the Antonioni films, I thought, how do they get the soft light? And I'd talk about it with Mike Saracen, and he was fascinated by this whole concept too, because with Fresnel lighting in those days, it was shadows everywhere. So on an impulse, we stripped all the sheets off the beds in the hotel, hung them up on frames in front of all the lights, and suddenly the shadows disappeared. And I think we just invented the soft light. All the rushes were being sent to Sydney for processing, and we didn't know it, but the lens that had been fitted into the camera had a flaw in it. And so for the last week of the film, we were shooting 18-hour days every day, and we got the rushes back for the last week after the whole film had wrapped, and it was all out of focus, every single shot, and it was like the last third of the whole movie. So we had to go back to reshoot, and we had to ask people if we could get back into their homes and do this reshoot. And the lens was sent out from Australia, and it was calibrated onto the new body again. And off we went, and we reshot the entire film up to that point, the entire last week of the film again, and that was sent off. And then the word came back, "Are you sitting down?" They said, "The whole lot is out of focus again." And by this time we were ready to slash our wrists. And it was one of those things that we measured focus, we were meticulous. We focused by eye, we measured it, we worked out depth of field, the whole thing. But that we found out there was not only a flaw in the lens, there was a flaw in the body and where the lens actually went into the body. So we had to scrap all that gear completely and go with a completely new system and reshoot it for a third time, but by which time the actors were really over it, and everyone was really over it. And it probably showed in the finished film. I think we were pretty bored by the end of it all. I'd been in Hollywood at the time, and a friend of mine was an editor who had cut all Martin Scorsese's stuff, and I said I could get some library footage to see if we could flesh it out and start it with, make it a story about cowboys on a train that get held up, and so we built it from there. And I got hold of my friend in New York and in Los Angeles, and he sent me stuff that he could sort of sneak out of the studios. And there were bits of all sorts of movies that came in which we were paying minimal or no royalty on, but he sort of got it out to us. And it was all perfectly legal. It was just done through a sort of a friendship basis rather than a hard commercial basis. The funny thing was, because it was my first production as under my own hat, as my own company, I had no idea how to budget properly, and I came to the end of the shoot and realised that I'd spent more than I'd been paid. So I sort of went into overdraft and had to borrow money, and I said to Roger, he said, "Oh, mate, that was fantastic commercial, everyone's loving it." I said, "Great, it'd be nice if I'd got paid because I'd spent all the money." Then one morning he came around, Saturday morning, came around, proudly opened the boot of his car and pulled out a Massport motor mower. He said, "Oh, in recognition of your services, we'd like to give you." So the longest running ad in Australasia, my fee was a motor mower on the Crunchie train robbery. We shot it in a little quarry outside Wellington. And the art director had no money, so he said, look, you've done all the work on this other job, so, you know, if you could throw this one in. So he said, oh, all right. So they put a tent up overnight on the beach, and then at midnight they went out and started to borrow 40-gallon drums of the Wellington City Council had used in roadworks, and brought them back, spray painted them green and put US Army on them, and we borrowed the fishing nets off the Italians that were on the beach and covered them to make it look like, you know, a set of a sort of an ammo dump. And I said, look, the actors, the only way we could dress them in uniforms was to get Taubman's caps and spray them green, and it was really make it up as you go along. I said, they should have dog tags, we need dog tags. And it was 5 in the morning, the art director looked around, suddenly saw a milkman delivering milk to all the houses nearby, rushed over and sneaked off the little silver caps off the milk bottles of each house and strung them around the actors as dog tags. And those poor people, when they came out and found bottles of milk with no caps on, must have wondered what in the hell happened. Shooting Spot the Dog for Telecom, again, it was the Saatchi's guys came and said, look, we've got these 3 ads to make and we need a little dog. And we started looking at all sorts of dogs, and this crazy woman came in with her little Jack Russell, and he jumped on a skateboard and he ran around carrying a suitcase, and we roared out with laughter. We said, he's great. So we made the 3 commercials that we were asked to make, and they were so hugely popular with the public. They said, we've got to make more, we've got to make more. So we started to make campaign after campaign after campaign with the little dog. And I remember at the time, he was so popular in New Zealand that when they did a survey as to who people were going to vote for Prime Minister, 30% of the country said Spot the Dog, you know. In the end, we made 130 commercials with Spot the Dog, so it was a lot of fun. And it was lovely not to have any pressure on us at all, because it was driven by the public. The public wanted it. Well, I remember when we went to the client meeting, the client sat there very nervously and said, are we really going to make a commercial using the B word? Hey, can you guarantee me this won't backfire? Is it going to work? And, you know, to their credit, Saatchi's were a very ballsy agency in Wellington. They are, to my mind, the best agency in the world that I've ever experienced, ever worked with, because they were willing to really put themselves on the line, and their suits would back the creatives all the way. It doesn't happen nowadays, very, very rarely. The industry has changed, unfortunately, since those days. But they persuaded the client that he had to, it might backfire, it might, you know, who knows what's going to happen, but if you want to really be different and get out there and get people talking about it, then you've got to take these chances. So the client looked at us and he just sort of shook his head and said, I know I'm mad, I know I'm crazy, but go for it. See what happens. It was extraordinary how, you know, how quickly the public, after a bit of uproar for some people, how quickly they were just hushed, and then the word bugger suddenly became acceptable and usable. I don't know if I've done a good thing or a bad thing there, but it's, you know, it was certainly very popular. I have a lot of regrets about what I would like to have done in cinema and didn't make it. I didn't become a Jane Campion or Peter Jackson, or, you know, but I suppose I'm happy that I've made icons. A lot of people look down on advertising, but if you can make icons from 1970 until now that the whole public love and talk about, then you've done something towards entertaining people at least. I suppose milestones in my time was to feel that I opened the door for independent filmmaking on television with Getting Together, that I helped create the whole freelance movement with Jeff Dixon, by setting up a production company with no staff, and then really finally getting the Film Commission up and going. And you know, it's a pity in some ways that I missed out on all of that by moving to Australia, but I spend so much time back here still working that I get the best of both countries, so I'm happy.